That's why we can bring you a program like Code Pink Radio, like Equal Rights and Justice, like Joy of Resistance, multicultural feminist radio on WBAI. I mean, where else are you going to hear this? You can hear it here on
میزنم به روی زخم برتنم فقط به حکم بودنم که من زنم چو هم صدا شویم و پا به پای هم رویم و دست به دست هم دهیم و از ستم رها شویم جهان دیگری بسازیم از برابری به همدلی و خواهری جهان شاد و بهتری نه سنگ و سارها نه پای چوب دارها نه گریه های بارها نه ننگارها جهان دیگری بسازیم از برابری به همدلی و خواهری جهان شاد و بهتری امروز روز جهانی زنه 110 ساله که روز جهانی زنه به افتخار
I am really pleased and honored to be about to speak with Maryam Namazie, who is a world-renowned activist for the rights of women living under theocracy and in general in countries in the Middle East. Let me start by saying that we are having you here on the almost 1 year anniversary of the murder of Mahsa Amini, otherwise known as Jina Amini, her Kurdish name, by the Iranian morality police, which sparked an insurrection of huge proportions, which went on for months and months and months, and is still going on in some forms. And that really shook the world under the heading of Women, Life, Freedom. And you as a woman originally from Iran and a political activist, have played a major part in keeping that struggle alive outside of the confines of Iran. We're going to be talking about that. But let me also refer to your work through which I've mostly known you. You have been a leader in the One Law for All campaign in Britain, where you live, in the UK, the Council of Ex-Muslims. Mm-hmm. So you represent an atheist and feminist tendency, right, in the world. And your work has just been extraordinary. Your work spans many areas, many geographic areas, many conceptual areas, but it's somehow all linked together. Before we get into the current anniversary and its meaning of the insurrection in Iran that took place over this last year, let's talk about the groups that you have organized with intriguing names such as One Law for All and the Council of Ex-Muslims. Can you describe what led you to do that work?
Sure. Thank you again for having me, Fran. It's such an honor to be speaking to you. And, I've been following your work over the years as well. So it's a great, great pleasure to finally get to speak with each other. For me, I started actually my work as a refugee rights activist, given the fact that my family was forced to flee Iran when an Islamic regime was established there. So I did decades of refugee organizing over the years. One of the most important aspects of that work was heading an organization called the International Federation of Iranian Refugees, which was a refugee-run organization. It had branches in 60 cities across the globe. Many of those leading the work in various cities were themselves under deportation orders, possibly living in hiding in countries like Turkey, Iraq, all the countries bordering Iran, but also internationally. And it was defending refugee rights work. And I still do quite a bit of that now, but I think it is all intertwined with the work I'm doing now too, because when you look at the reasons why people are forced to flee, I think that's what the One Law for All campaign and the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain address aspects of those reasons. One is, of course, under One Law for All, campaigning against Sharia and religious laws, whether it's the Beth Din, which is the Jewish court in Britain, Sharia courts in Britain. We actually have these in a country like Britain. And if you look at the laws that are being imposed via these courts in the UK, you see that they're very similar to the laws that are being imposed on women in countries like Iran and Afghanistan. It does only deal with family issues. So obviously there's no stonings and amputations. There's not the criminal aspect of Sharia code, but the family code, which is really where the crux of discrimination against women take place. That is being implemented in the UK. So that's one aspect of the work I've been doing over the past, I think, 15, 20 years now. And then the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain is the other aspect of it, which is the fact that you can be killed in 13 countries under Islamic rules, including in Iran. If you are an atheist, if you are an apostate, if you leave Islam, if you are a blasphemer, someone who criticizes or mocks religion, some people might find that uncomfortable. The reality is that that is very much part and parcel of freedom of conscience and expression. So I find all of this work kind of very much linked with challenging theocracy and fundamentalism in Iran and across the globe.
Okay, let me ask you for a little more description of the situation in the UK around Sharia law courts. How much authority do they have? Whom do they affect, etc.?
Well, there are at least 100 Sharia law courts in the UK. And what's important to recognize is that they are using the legal framework of mediation in order to function, because, as you know, private citizens can go to mediation courts or mediation sort of centers in order to address specific issues. Usually it's around business, for example. Let's say if you have a specific business conflict and you want to go to a court that is well versed in that aspect of business, both parties might voluntarily agree to go to that court in order to have a specific, very specialized issue addressed. For example, employment tribunals are one example of mediation courts. Now they're using that as a way of opening the space for religious tribunals. And the point that we make with religious tribunals is that, one, it has to be voluntary. And it's very difficult to prove that women voluntarily go to a tribunal where they have lesser rights than if they went to a civil court here in the UK.
Can you describe what you mean by lesser rights? Can you be specific?
Sure, definitely. I'll explain that too. But I also want to say that the other condition of going to a sort of arbitration tribunal is that both parties have to be on equal footing. And again, that's not the case when it comes to Sharia courts, because a woman's testimony, for example, is worth half that of a man's. So already the two parties are not on equal footing. And why I say these laws are discriminatory is because if you look at Sharia laws where it applies to women, particularly in the family, we know that, for example, women have very limited rights to divorce. Men have unilateral right to divorce. They can say talaq, 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 which means divorce, divorce, divorce 3 times, and they can be divorced. Whereas women have very limited rights, and very often things such as domestic violence is not a reason to get a divorce from your husband. Marital rape is not a reason to get a divorce from your husband. As a Sharia judge, for example, said on national British TV, to call sex by the husband rape, when it's rape, if you call it rape, that's the actual act of aggression, because there's no such thing as rape in marriage, for example. That's their perspective. The husband has a right to have sex with his wife whenever he wants, whether she likes it or not. So we have situations where women are facing huge amounts of violence and the court refuses to give them a divorce. The issue of child custody is another issue. Men get child custody at a preset age, irrespective of the welfare of the child. So, all of these sort of gives prerogative to men in order to be able to do as they want, and women have very limited rights. And so you can understand why it's very questionable how women would choose to go somewhere where they wouldn't get child custody. Can you imagine a woman not wanting child custody, or wanting to remain in a violent situation, even though she's the one who's trying to get a divorce? Because if the man wants a divorce, he can get it. The problem is when women want it, because they don't have that right to get it.
So women are pressured, women who are in the Muslim community in Britain, to have their family matters arbitrated by Sharia law courts. And I understand your organization is saying, no, we want one law for all. You don't want those courts to have authority. So how is that struggle playing out?
The reality is that the numbers are really high, because if you look at the Jewish Beth Din, it deals with Orthodox women. So it's a very small number that go to these courts. And there's lots of discrimination in these courts as well. As you can imagine, all religious courts are discriminatory against women. Imagine if women in the US or the UK decided that they want to go to an ecclesiastic court. Would they really decide to do that, where there's very limited rights for women and men have all the say really in a lot of issues related to the family? They're considered the head of the household. What they decide goes. And so you can imagine that it's not something that women would likely choose. There is a lot of pressure, and we've dealt with a lot of women who have said that they've been pressured into going. And apart from that, a lot of the Sharia judges, but also Islamic organizations have said that women who decide not to go to a Sharia court and instead go to a civil court, they're akin to being apostates, and which believing woman would want to be labeled an apostate? So in a sense, it is this unbelievable pressure. And I think an important point to remember is that these courts were established in the 80s. And that is exactly corresponds with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and religious fundamentalism in the region of the Middle East, but also as we've seen across the globe. Our argument is that it's very much not about people's right to religion, because religion is a private matter. Having the right to a religion is very different to living in a theocratic state or having your rules decided in a religious court. And that it's very much a fundamentalist project to manage and control and limit women and their rights. Unfortunately, if we look at the situation in Britain, it's not really a secular state. It is very much a religious state, to the extent that there's a Church of England. It's an established church. The king that's there now, he is the head of the established church. Imagine there are prayers in schools and in parliament. I mean, that seems absurd for those living in the United States. And also, there are bishops in the House of Lords, for example. They're not elected, but just because they are bishops, they have a say in the laws that get passed in the country. So it is very much not a secular state, but it's a very secularized society. And that's why it seems contradictory when we know this of Britain. And so in a sense, that's why the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time had said there's nothing wrong with having Sharia courts, because when you do have one religion having that privileged position, you want to make sure that other religions have that position too, so that there's less likelihood that the established religion will be challenged. And I think that's what we're seeing in the UK. And also the other aspect of it is that I think the British state and a lot of Western governments feel that by appeasing the Islamists when it comes to women's rights, that they can sort of manage this fundamentalist movement. So you see them welcoming the Taliban back in Afghanistan. You see, for example, Western governments having such close relations with the Saudi regime. It is, in a sense, at the expense always, first and foremost, at the expense of women's rights. So I think this is that sort of misguided view that let's have Sharia courts, things will be better. But if you actually look at countries that have Sharia courts, there's an increase in violence against women because they are, if we're frank, legal vehicles for imposing violence and discrimination against women.
I have to say that in the United States, we have creeping fundamentalism beginning to gallop even in many areas to where the overturning of Roe versus Wade recently, really with sort of Christian nationalism in back of it.
Can I just make a point too, that the point we always make is that Islamic fundamentalism, with the rise of that, we've seen a corresponding rise with Christian fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism, Buddhist fundamentalism. They are all linked with each other. And that's why I think what's happening in Iran is so key, because if there is a women's revolution challenging Islamic fundamentalism in that country, it will have a corresponding positive effect against fundamentalism across the globe in the same way that the establishment of an Islamic regime in Iran had a positive effect on the rise of fundamentalism, negative for us, but positive for them across the globe as well. And that's why I think Iran is so key for people who care about rights and human decency. You know, I think that's why all eyes really need to be on Iran, supporting it, showing solidarity with it, preventing Western government intervention, because usually when they intervene, it's always for one oppressive force or another.
Yes.
And how can we get people intervening both against their own governments, but also to prevent any sort of engineering from above? And we're seeing signs of that already in Iran before anything's even happened yet. So it's worrying, but also very inspiring and positive at the same time.
Yes, yes. And we're speaking with Maryam Namazie, who is at the center of a lot of the organizing against the oppression of women under theocracies. In particular, we're talking about Iran today on the anniversary of the uprising in Iran that has gone on for, well, really most of the year. And we'll be speaking about that in a minute. I am glad, Maryam, that you are making those connections with the rise of fundamentalism. And we are also, of course, getting into an area which seems to be a particular problem for the U.S. left and the left around the world. The whole idea that the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. Therefore, if the United States, for imperialist reasons, would like to conquer or take over or whatever Iran, therefore, any uprising that is going on among Iranian people must somehow be CIA influenced, or the United States must be in back of it. We've been getting a lot of that coming from the left. And indeed, there are people who are very pro-U.S. imperialism, who are also, of course, lauding this insurrection in Iran. So how do we kind of parse all that out?
I think that the thing to think about is that if you look at Islamic fundamentalism in the region and also in Iran, if you look at the Islamic regime of Iran, it is a hugely anti-working class and anti-women's rights totalitarian state. So imagine you're talking about a state that actually flogs workers for celebrating May Day. You know, the 1st of May, International Workers' Day. A lot of those who are in long-term imprisonment under torture, they are labor rights activists. They've been organizing for, better wages, payment of back wages, better working conditions. And these are seen to be crimes in Iran. In fact, Ayatollah Khomeini, that established the Islamic regime of Iran, he said that to strike is considered haram, which is religiously prohibited. So you're dealing with a regime that is, fundamentally inhuman, anti-working class, anti the left. Look, we know that theocracies in particular, and also US backed dictators across the globe, they have come for the left first. And this has been the case with the Islamic regime of Iran as well. I mean, I think for those left who see the Islamic regime of Iran as something that's wonderful and needs to be supported, I would say that they have a sort of historical amnesia to begin with, because The Iranian Revolution in 1979 was a left-leaning revolution, and in fact, it was expropriated by the Islamic movement. And for it to establish the Islamic regime of Iran, there was the slaughter of an entire generation, and many of them were on the left because it was a left-leaning revolution. And in fact, left political organizations had the upper hand. And if they look at documents that are now public because the time has passed, they can see very clearly that Western governments met in Guadeloupe and they decided that they prefer an Islamic state to the left-leaning political groupings that had the upper hand during the revolution. And it might seem bizarre today, but if you remember in 1979, that was during the Cold War, and we all remember that the US government was trying to establish a green Islamic belt around the Soviet Union at the time. So we all know, for example, that the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were trained and armed by the United States. That was part of its foreign policy. So actually, the establishment of an Islamic regime in Iran was part of U.S. imperialism in that region. Yes, the revolution overthrew one of the U.S.'s dictatorships, the Shah's dictatorships in Iran. And there's a long history of U.S. intervention, not just in Iran, but across the globe. But interestingly enough, that was their solution to when they realized that the Shah's leaving. They thought, well, what best to have than an Islamic state? So, in fact, there's an American general. He came to Iran and spoke to the army and asked them not to intervene any longer, that decision had been made. So there's all these historical documents that can be looked at. And I think, interestingly, Islamism was brought to center stage as a result of U.S. foreign policy at the time. Of course, now it stands on its own feet. It's vying for political power against other political blocs. But its establishment and bringing it to center stage.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the flame of women's rage, kept smoldering for centuries.
You have been listening to Maryam Namazie, an international women's rights activist, Iranian-born. We will play part 2 of that in a coming show. This has been the Joy of Resistance Multicultural Feminist Radio. Please support WBAI and become a buddy for this show. You won't get an analysis like this anywhere else. Thank you so much for listening.
You have told us to speak softly, to be gentle, and to smile.
Hello, everyone. I'm Camilla Reese, and I'm running for a seat